All right. Welcome, everyone, to the B2B Influence Podcast. I'm your host, Paula Kioki, CEO of Outward Media. And today's business marketplace, we're being asked to do more with less signal, less certainty, and less patience from leadership. Performance still matters, but the rules keep changing. And I don't think anybody knows better about this than my guest today, which is Simon Poultime. He is from, I want to say it right, Tinuity?
Continuity, yeah. Like continuity, but without the con.
Yeah,
There
yeah,
you go.
yeah. So it's one of the most respected brands in performance marketing today. So I'm very excited to have Simon join us as a guest. So we're going to jump right in here, Simon.
Love it.
Okay, so from your vantage point, what feels most broken in B2B performance marketing right now? And what's quietly working better than people realize?
Okay, so it's a multi-part. I think broadly, just for quite some time, there's been this big focus on just the conversion flow and journey that we expect users to follow. And I listened to a couple of the other episodes, and I think this is a common theme that I'm hearing from some of the other conversations we've been having. And that is really around this idea of consumers doing a lot, or especially in the B2B space, because it's such a highly considered decision often, that so much of the research is happening beyond your walls, beyond your framing of this. When I started, gosh, years and years and years ago, when I was fresh out of college, I was working in the B2B space for a company called Laserfish, which is a enterprise content management software company for compliance centric industries. So bit of a mouthful, but
Okay.
also, it's a hard one. It was a hard one to get out there, but it was also the sort of this moment that inbound was really coming into vogue, and it was this moment of marketing automation. And I look back on that and go, I just don't know if any of that is really going to work anymore. This idea of forcing consumers, forcing users through this experience to get a white paper, to get a PDF, something like that. I think that moment in time is slipping away, and the more that we are focusing on how a consumer's researching, they're doing it off-site. So you do need to start putting a lot more information out there. And yet, I still think there's this, I'll call it infatuation, where everything needs to be gated for whatever reason. And I think it's because the metrics that we're using often are, we're looking at number of leads that have been acquired, and that is important. But if you get 100 leads and only one converts, you may as well have had one lead and one converts, right? And I know it's not quite that simple, but that's what I'm seeing is most broken right now in the space. In terms of what's working, though, I think it is those brands that we're seeing who are now embracing this idea of putting more content out there. They're embracing the realities of what it means to be engaging with the LLM informed consumer, how they are doing research, and frankly how relevant they are in this moment. I think we're also probably on the precipice of what I'll call agentic lead gen. We're talking about a lot about agentic commerce in the commerce space, right? Where a consumer is able to transact via an LLM. I think Walmart and ChatGPT is the best example of that right now. But the idea of agentic lead gen, I think, is one that is very relevant and probably very likely to come about soon. And that is where the LLMs will essentially serve as a pre-qualifying mechanism where consumers can engage in, where frankly I don't need to go and fill out these forms. I would love, actually, once I know what I want, to be able to go set up a few demos or set up a few initial conversations with folks without having to go through each of their individual sites and then get on these mailing lists and so forth, right? Because again, I'm researching, but ultimately that's I think creating a bit of a shortcut toward actually talking with a human.
So how are you all addressing that at Tinuity?
Yeah, so Tenuity, well, I mean, we work with a number of B2B organizations, and I think the first step of it, and this is my sort of fundamental belief on all aspects of marketing and advertising, is that it always comes back to measurement. I spent the last decade of my career leading the digital intelligence and data science team at a couple other agencies, and so right now I'm head of innovation here, which sort of that perfectly led it up to. But the reason why we sort of um, look to use tactics or look to yeah, use different tactics that aren't necessarily going to gain advantage is because they are tied to legacy KPIs, just like how we're looking at the number of leads, the number of qualified leads. I think that mindset is one that is not necessarily helping brands grow. So the brands that we're seeing that are opening themselves up to this idea of, well, actually, we want to take more of a branding play. We actually want to cultivate this moment and make sure that the folks know who we are, so we are in the consideration set as they're going through this journey without us even having an opportunity to speak with them. And as part of that, I think the ones that are succeeding now are, they're not necessarily seeing great success from the fact that they have an LLM agent on their website. Some of them do, some of them don't. But the ones that do are really able to mine some of the really interesting questions from those discussions. They're able to start to look at, well, what are the conversations that we're having with consumers or prospects when they first engage us, and how can we preemptively answer that before they even get to this point, which I know sort of, cuts into the role of certain functions in an organization. But the more that you have analyzed what information you're putting out there versus what information folks are asking you about, that's where that disconnect is. And so the brands that are leaning in are the ones who are, one, changing their measurement optics, and then two, looking at the opportunity to bring more of that information to the forefront.
So are you seeing a big increase in social media then?
Yeah, so broadly, yes, and I've always thought that there's always been this big opportunity. I'll say the beyond LinkedIn opportunity. While I appreciate LinkedIn for what it does and the role it serves, one of the things I've been thinking about more and more is, of course, it's social network, but it's this idea. And I don't think I coined it, but we've seen retail media networks have broadened what they are. So it used to be a retail media network was something that you would use on like Amazon, right? You would have an ad and then you could transact. And then financial media networks popped up like Chase. And Chase Media Network doesn't actually have any ad inventory. They just have audiences. And I think it would seem logical that the way this goes is toward business media networks. And I think that social is the first sort of point on the map that would make me start to think, well, there is something to this idea that, you can be better using these ecosystems for targeting. I think obviously Reddit seems to be one that we're seeing a lot more interaction with. I think the prevailing theory in the industry is still if you're advertising on Reddit, you're going to influence conversations. Maybe. I don't know. I haven't seen any data that actually really states that, but it serves to reason that if you're in these highly niche communities and you're targeting the folks in there, that you are going to have some success. So I think going beyond LinkedIn, we are seeing some success there with those clients. But honestly, I think the bulk of investment is still really heavily focused around the Google ecosystem, in particular YouTube and search being the dominant strains.
But for B2B?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay,
for B2B. Yeah,
okay,
yeah,
okay.
exactly. And I think, in part that's also when you look at Google, you look at AI mode. AI mode having ads is a really interesting evolution in the space. And we're recording this the day after the Super Bowl. So for anyone who watched Super Bowl, you probably saw those ads from Anthropic where
Yeah.
they were pretty critical of OpenAI, talking about ads in that moment. And look, maybe they're trying to win in the court of public opinion. I thought it was a little bit disingenuous. I'm certainly not thinking that OpenAI is going to have an amazing ad product, but the nature of the ad assistance in that moment, it's not something that's being tied into the conversation. But this is what's critical and I'll go back to AI mode as I'm using this point, because what Google said about 9 months ago was that ads in AI mode are going to take into account both the prompt as well as the context or the content of the response. And in that regard, it is incredibly important to have a strong SEO play because you need to have relevance not just in the prompt, but in the actual response that you're receiving in order for that ad to show up. And I think that is where a number of practitioners I speak to, a number of CMOs in the B2B space that I speak to, they're really in on using AI mode and using Perplexity and a few other tools where they're realizing that this is such a complex piece. Like even to research in the space, I need to know all these acronyms and what they all mean. And I need assistance with this. And that's exactly the journey that prospects are going on as well as they are thinking about how do I even understand the space, let alone how it relates to this pain point or problem that I have. I think, and just to go back to the enterprise content management example, no one in that space calls it enterprise content management. They say, I have um, a FOIA problem. I need to get FOIA requests out on time. That was their real challenge. But we said ECM's the answer. And it was just such a disconnect of language. And it's like someone, honestly, whenever a plumber comes to my house and they tell me what they've done, I'm like, oh, okay. I have no idea. I just know that I have a blocked toilet, right? Like that's
Yeah,
it's
and you
more
pay
about
the
like
bill.
yeah, yeah, and so I appreciate some of the education that's provided
Yeah,
at that moment, but
yeah.
in the B2B space, we don't really have much opportunity other than to have to go down this path and to understand what is being said because the industry is so full of jargon and terminology, especially the more that we're in little bubbles. I again think a lot about the software space, all the terminology we would use. And the nature of that being one that, well, if we can break that down and make it easier, we always talk about storytelling there. I go, yeah, and storytelling for the LLMs is a really important piece of this to help them deconstruct what these concepts are and frame them in a way that is more likely to be aligned with how your brand positions them or how your business positions them, because that I think is where this sort of bias will come in from the consumer. Is how can we influence that bias towards certain signals that we have and then show that ad. So that's where I'm really looking at, and where honestly a lot of the very big interest from the advertisers that we work with in the B2B space is coming from is how can we really make sure that these ads in AI mode, where we think a lot more B2B questions and discussions are happening, how can we make sure those ads are going to be highly performant?
And you're just getting involved in that now.
Yeah, so the
Okay.
the ads in have you seen an ad in AI mode? Have
A
do you
what?
use AI do you use AI mode in
Yes.
Google? Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Have you seen an ad in there?
I think so, but I don't know. I
It's one
can't
of the
thing.
Yeah, right, but, like,
Okay.
you've seen an ad on Google search.
Yeah.
Uh, so it's one of those interesting things where, Google has said these have been there for a while, but we haven't quite come around the corner as to them being, prolific and present across all these queries. I think Google's playing a little balancing game with it. But they have said that they're here. I've taken a screenshot of a few of them, and what we've found, early on is that really these are using, it's an RS a responsive search ad structure, and in order to actually perform well in the space, well, you need 1,000 ad assets essentially. Whenever you create an RSA structure, you get 7 headlines, 14 headlines, 4 descriptions. You can create 48,000 permutations of ads. That is a really great opportunity, but oftentimes brands will just go, "This is our brand message. This is what we want to populate it with," and they'll just use the same headline for all four. But that really doesn't take into account how the algorithm is working and how they are looking for the ultimate personalization of that ad with the question and with the response there. So we developed a tool called Ad Copy AI, which
Right.
is essentially looking at linguistic diversification, because there are words that I use that, as someone who is not in a certain industry, to describe concepts that they may already have defined. The way that I'm searching, though, I want to see it reflected in the ad, because even if they've done like they transpose, like, well, Simon was looking at FOIA management. Turns out that's ECM. We'll call it ECM in the ad. That is not going to connect with me. And so what we're looking at here is, well, how do you best mirror the way that prospects are speaking early on when they're uninformed? And that's really, I think, that moment that is somewhat enlightening, in that if I really put my tinfoil hat on, where does this go? I go, I think there is a world of what we'll call atomized assets associated with ads, where every brand will approve hundreds of images, hundreds of videos, hundreds of voiceovers, hundreds of brand messages, and they will all be combined at the right moment in that ad experience, not just text, but video, visual, all those. And that will present a unique ad to one user at one time. But that's going to be a really hard challenge for brands to reckon with when it comes to compliance with their taglines, and
Yeah.
even compliance with just, like, is this a real thing that your tool can do? And so that's been something that we've been reckoning with, especially in the B2B space, where there are a lot of highly regulated clients that we work with, who it's like, if you make this claim, we're actually going, like, someone will sue us. And so it's one of those moments of, like, okay, so we definitely can't use these sort of auto-generated ads that Google's running with. We really have to think critically about how can we both meet the consumer where they are, but also maintain legal compliance.
Yep. It's interesting that you bring that up because I just read some study this weekend by Jasper, I think is the name of the company. One of the number one things they're using the AI for is to build all the different assets on the fly
Yeah.
to propagate the ones that make sense for how they're responding, the person
Yeah.
responding. Exactly what you just said, with compliance and legal being a hurdle.
A- Absolutely.
You just shortened the
Yeah.
study.
Well, I think, I think a lot of it is based on how the platforms are going to bring this to life, and if they're going to have some kind of automation there. But then it's also on the brands as they start to, I'll call it, break the mold, because that's also one of these things that is a little difficult. Is there's such love often for, this is the brand that we've cultivated, this is what we stand for, and sometimes you do have to color outside the lines a little bit to see that language that we are forced to use doesn't actually work with this group. Like, we kind of need to be a little bit more general. Or, I don't know. It's sort of, have you seen ugly ads on Meta, like those ones where it's like someone went opened Microsoft Paint and they're like, "I'm an intern and you should buy our stuff." I've always looked at those ads. I'm like, oh, those aren't great ads, but they are thumb stopping. They are engaging. And I saw Colgate do one recently. I was like, well, if Colgate can do it, why can't all these other brands that are, so fiercely protective of their brand, but ultimately are not connecting with the consumer because they are so stuck in this mindset that they have, and not the ability to connect to who a consumer is at that moment in time.
Mm. So switching gears a little bit,
Yeah.
attribution is always a big issue.
Yes. Absolutely.
So, and it's probably messier than it's ever been. How do you think B2B leaders should redefine performance, especially when data isn't clean?
Yeah. Okay. So this is this is a tough one. Well, they're all tough, but it helps to maybe know the background. I built an attribution tool years ago. I built it on top of the Atlas tag within the Meta ecosystem before iOS 14.5. For a while, I sat on the Meta Attribution Advisory Council, and I was infatuated by this idea of attribution, especially complex attribution and B2B cycles. And I was like, well, there's this, we can kind of get away with like a little bit of like, splitting the baby of, there's this sort of post known attribution when we'll go through the human interactions that occur. And then there's this pre known attribution that we can stitch together with these click based signals. But that's not a reality, or not inherently reflective of ultimately what's happening. And to me, what it always comes down to is simply, do you have confidence that your media investment is working for you? So this may sound a little bit like a heretic, but I'm less concerned about individual touch points within the grand ecosystem. And I'm more concerned, and certainly not deterministic touch points. I think when we over index on deterministic signal, what you're doing is just listening to the loudest voice in the room. And oftentimes it's going to be last click on Google search. Now, last click on Google search does have a good time and place here, but if you overinvest there, you're not ultimately going to see much growth, and you'll start going, wow, this is really expensive just to be sort of harvesting what's at the bottom of the funnel. So that is where I really am advocating fervently for brands to just, one, take your deterministic attribution and sort of put it on one side, but really challenge yourself to say, do we have confidence in our reinvestment? And if not, have we done any incrementality tests? What is our scope of experiment willingness? How a lot of companies talk about having this experiment driven culture. And then you talk to them and you go, well, how many experiments have you run in the last 12 months? And they go, well, two. And you're like, I don't know if that's an experiment driven culture. I think it means you're open to it. It just means that like there's no one really driving it internally.
Mhm.
And so I like to think of myself as a bit of a heretic, and that is acknowledging that there are things in our industry that work at one time, and we'll test them and go great, and then 6 months later we go, oh, it's still working. We still think it's driving the same. And you're like, do you really think that, or is this just what, frankly, makes it look better when you speak to your boss about how you're performing, how you're running ads, or is this something that you should then be very mindful of to consider and say, look, there's no sacred cows. Let's actually test this again. Let's revalidate. And use that as part of our overarching approach to this. And I think especially when we think about the complexities of high velocity media mix modeling in the B2B space, especially with like low lead volume organizations, that is complicated. And I don't think a lot of some brands can very easily move into the MMM era because they have such volume and they have these relatively clean pipelines. Most brands can't. And that's where I'm a really strong advocate to say, well, that is exactly why incrementality is the place that you need to be playing more than anything, rather than even trying to focus on how do I stitch everything together. Just go, is this tactic within Google search working for me or not? And if not, let's redeploy into a novel medium.
When you say incrementality, could you expand on that a little bit?
Oh, sure. So incrementality as a, well, essentially it's the scientific study of lift, and the idea that what would have happened if this ad was not shown. Would a conversion have occurred if you were only running a search campaign? How many conversions would you get? And then, okay, well, what if you're running a search campaign and a social campaign? There's going to be some overlap in there. And whenever we look at deterministic attribution, oftentimes you'll see, oh, well, they're sharing it. And then we talk about, well, why don't we have this, a linear model or a time decay model? And all of that is trying to account for all these touch points that are occurring. But in reality, a touch point itself does not actually indicate influence. It just indicates that someone saw an ad. That's why remarketing ads often will claim so much of the attribution, because they sit there at the bottom of the funnel, and also every single person who came to your website is now getting one of those remarketing ads.
Right.
That is not it might look great on paper, but how do you know it's actually driving any actual incremental conversions? You don't. And so in order to achieve this, you need to, there's two major approaches. One is you can take a user-based approach. So you can work within the platforms like Google, and you can use their native experiment tools to essentially hold out a subset of the audience with the ID-based approach. Or you can do a geo-based approach where you are actually holding out certain geographies in a match market test. None of this is all that new, right? I think, but the renaissance of incrementality testing really came about because of the renaissance, or the modern type of high velocity media mix modeling. And so there are companies like House and Measured and a few others that are really big on this. Not to sit here and plug my own podcast, but I did a
Oh,
podcast recently with Nick Stoltz from Measured. It's
okay.
the Measure Up Marketing Analytics podcast, and we just dissect how exactly incrementality works, how exactly, and what signals do you derive from it? How are the smartest brands leveraging this? Because it really is basically, when iOS 14.5 came around, I had this moment of, how would we ever measure in a world where we had zero deterministic signals? Like, I know we still have some, but like, let's imagine we have zero, and this is the way you would do it. And so it's always basically approaching this moment going, tomorrow we could have zero signal, and right now we get these signals, but I don't even know how true these signals are. All of the deterministic signals you get from Google and Meta and others, those are all heavily modeled. So when you're thinking about the actual touch points that are occurring and you think about the inherent challenges of, I don't know, everyone working from home and all these things where you don't necessarily have these IPs you can lock onto, you really do need to focus more at the macro level of, if this channel was not turned on, how would my media perform? And then if it is turned on, what is the incremental gain I get from that, so you can best allocate that investment in the future?
But if is it really deterministic if it's highly modeled?
So sorry, that is the data that's coming from the
Okay,
platforms.
okay,
Yeah.
okay.
So so it is a deterministic sample, and then
Mhm,
it's highly modeled. And so I've always used deterministic largely to basically describe, these are clicks that we can for sure see, and then there are impressions that we can't really see. And in this world, it's sort of a, well, Google models up from, I don't know, 40% of deterministic signal to this probabilistic 100%. And then we go outside of that and go, let's just say we don't believe anyone anywhere. The only thing we can see is we've spent this much on media and market, and we know where we've covered that media in terms of like geographies, and then we know we got this many conversions in this time period. Those are the only data points we have. Let's see if this media is actually valuable, or frankly, if we're just investing because we've always been investing.
mhm. Got it. So, where do you think agencies still add the most value for B2B organizations, and where should brands be self-sufficient by now?
Yeah, I think there was a bit of a wave of what I'll call um, the PMAX commodification wave, where a lot of brands sort of looked at PMAX and Performance Max within Google, and the idea here being that you just say, this is my goal, and the platform will optimize appropriately to achieve that goal.
Mhm.
I think there were fits and starts early, so some folks have different opinions as to the value of PMAX. I think overall it is a very useful campaign type, and I'm using PMAX very broad because almost every platform has an AI based or a machine learning based optimization mechanism now. But I don't think that reality actually is mirrored in how brands operate, because there are inherent complexities. And so when I think about the value of the agency here, I think about it in two forms. One is, when everything gets commoditized, it is harder to find that extra 5% lever on top. And that's really what we're honing in on when we're working with clients. We're going, oh, well, we're learning this thing over here. We're learning a lot from commerce that we're bringing over to B2B. These signals that we're seeing of, how do we actually best optimize this? What are the best signals to be pushing back? How should we think about lead scoring signals coming back in as a form of value based bidding, not simply just a, this is a good lead or not, but like actually giving propensity scores within that loop and having the data scientific process really highly integrated. And then the second side of it, and I think this is, gosh, this is we could do an entire podcast just on this, but it is the advent of the hyphenated marketer. And the idea here is the marketer that is not just a marketer, but a marketer coder or a marketer analyst. And I think, this has been going on for a little while, but the marketer coder one in particular, when we think about the tooling that is coming into play, that is what a lot of teams can be building on their own internally. But to work with an agency really does accelerate that process. So when we're thinking about, like, gosh, I built so many tools. I built one called the Meta Ad Atomizer that takes all the meta ads in a library, breaks them down into their smallest parts, and then looks to understand the potential differentiation between the ads that you're putting in market, so you can better understand, is this going to get out of the learning phase? It's a bit of a complex one, but those are the kind of tools that at the agency side we're able to build, and then brands can take those and start tinkering with them. I think that some brands can get away with a lot more in housing and functions, but there's also just this inherent risk of the key man problem where oftentimes it'll be one single catalyst internally. I remember my days in the B2B world when I was in house, and I was often that single catalyst. And when I left that organization, still 3 years later, they were using the exact same tooling and the exact same. I was like, okay, so like it really, you do need these sort of catalyst individuals. Otherwise, it's really great to be working with an agency to really start to figure that out. But also, be really mindful of how much of this can we or should we be in housing, and how do we better partner? Because I think the agency brand relationship is ripe for redefinition, and it's one that is likely to change in the coming years as we do see a greater degree of commoditization on top of the levers.
Yeah, that's what I've been reading as well. I agree with you on that.
Love
So,
it.
it's an evolution.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
right? So, if you were advising a CMO heading into the next planning cycle, what's one strategic shift you think they should make now?
Well, that the nature of that is one where I would look to do obviously a lot of research, and I'll have a lot of discussions with them as to what have they historically ignored, and what haven't they had their focus on. I don't know if it's a shift that like, well, you know what? I'm always surprised by the number of brands that are still looking at SEO purely through the lens of SEO. They're not looking at it through the lens of holistic brand amplification across all mediums. Modern SEO slash GEO slash AI SEO, whatever we want to call it, is really not just about that search experience. It is about how present and how much volume there is and how much discussion there is around your brand across social networks, across even just how people speaking about you in general terms, and having a better degree of monitoring there to better understand how are you influencing that conversation, how are you influencing that perception, I think is probably one of the more under invested in areas, rather than a lot of brands can just look at it now and go, yeah, we've got our SEO person on it. And you're like, I don't know if that is going to be enough in this next era, because that's really going to define your ability to cultivate attention, because it will lead ads. And so if you want your media performance if you want your ad spend to perform, you're going to need to think about that holistic brand representation in an organic capacity first.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree with you. So, wow, this is keeping up with you is yeah,
High velocity. Yeah.
yeah, high velocity. I love it. So you obviously have a wealth of information, and as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, your company is extremely well respected. If somebody wanted to have a chat with you, what would be the best way to get in touch with you?
Yeah, LinkedIn is going to be the play. So that's just Simon Polton, SIMON POULTON. You can just search me on there, and it's a picture of me in a purple vest pointing like that.
I've seen that picture.
There you go. Yeah,
And then the company, I want to get this right. It's spelled TINUITI.com.
that's right. Tenuity.com. Yep.
Is that how you say it, Tanuki?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Excellent. So, Simon, it was great pleasure to have you on, and I would like to have another conversation with you in the future.
Love it. Thanks, Paula.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes. Bye.
Bye. That's it for today's episode of B2B Influence. If you picked up something new or found yourself rethinking your approach, take a second to subscribe, leave a quick comment, and share this episode with your network. And don't forget, once we hit 25,000 subscribers, one lucky listener will win a free customer analysis. Just subscribe and comment to enter. If you want to be a guest or know someone pushing the boundaries in B2B marketing, tap the link in the show notes to nominate or apply. And if you're ready to fuel smarter campaigns and more accurate targeting, check out what we're doing at OMI.